Good evening, guys. This is Chapter 25 lecture, the last of the three chapters that will be on your test on the Tuesday after we return. Again, you guys will be able to ask any questions you guys have on Monday when you return while we're playing our Steel Empire game, and then also you will have a review session on Monday night. But let's begin. This is America Moves to the City, 1865 to 1900, focusing on urbanization. Urbanization is a city movement where you have people moving into the cities either internally. You have migration coming from the countryside or externally people coming in as immigrants. What we notice in the United States that's going to be different than Europe and all the other places that we're going to be studying in our class is that in America, since America is so modern as far as becoming a country, it doesn't have a lot of landmarks and historical stuff that's blocking the building of new structures, buildings, etc. And so as a result, in the United States, when they come up with new inventions like skyscrapers or trolley cars or whatever, America can embrace that. Where over in Europe, they've got so much history that's going to make it really hard to tear stuff down, that they're going to not be revolutionizing as quickly as America does, although they will definitely be modernizing at the same pace. But America's growth is going to be rapid. So we're going to see that there's a lot of growth happening in places like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. And we're going to see other cities around the world will also be going through the same sort of urbanization process. As we take a look at this, then, our country status is going to flip in the 1920s, where up until this time it's been very safe saying that if you're talking about Americans, they're most likely farmers. But it's around this time period from 1860 to 1900 that you're about to see more and more people living in an urban rather than a rural space. What's going to be causing this to take place is the growth of skyscrapers, which is happening because of the perfection of the perfection of steel through the Bessemer process. People like Louis Sullivan are going to be realizing that you can build skyscrapers that are higher than you could on iron skeleton skyscrapers that had limits based on weight, since iron was not as strong as steel. You're going to see that these cities then will start exploding, and America will start looking very different in the late 1800s. They're going to rely on mass transit with things like subways and trolley cars moving people around out into the suburbs, where people will be moving away from the inner city core. You're going to see the walking cities that we used to have now changing quite a bit because transportation will allow people to move over longer distances. So the modern cities we see are going to be emerging during this time, largely driven because there are large numbers of industrial jobs that will then attract large numbers of people into the cities. Inside the cities, whenever there's inventions like city lights, electricity, indoor plumbing, telephones, they're going to revolutionize what the cities look like. And again, this is going from very much the small sort of rundown sort of towns that you could imagine from our early textbook to cities that look more like downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so on nowadays. All these innovations are going to become really the calling card for the United States. Like the Brooklyn Bridge right here is going to become something that is a symbol of United States advancement as we have technologies that are revolutionary. And it's very much making America look cosmopolitan and up to date. We'll find also inside the cities, you see commerce taking place. Places like Macy's and Marshall Field's, modern day mall stores that you might have heard of, get their roots during this time period as people are able to buy pretty much anything inside these department stores that will then be used to enhance in consumerism during this time period. You've got markets that are developing, and very much these markets are creating the feeling that you can throw stuff away quickly. Things are disposable rather than being like on the farm where you had to use and reuse over and over again. You're going to find that this is a totally different sort of environment then. It looks very much like our modern world where you have cheap, ready-to-wear clothing, fashions that will change out clothing not because it's worn out, but because it's just not in style. We've got all sorts of issues that are going to start emerging, like what do we do with waste, and what do we do with extra individuals in our city who are not adjusting well, like criminals. What do you do with sanitation? What do you do with water, and other sorts of things that are getting polluted? You've got all the urban problems that we have nowadays that starts emerging in the late 1800s as a result of these transformations in Chapter 25. So for our cities, what you're going to see is very much a rise of distinct different groups, largely because they're going to be setting up different sections of the city for different groups of people. There will be beautiful upper class neighborhoods, and then the slums you'll have where people who are lower income are going to find themselves living. You'll find that there are industrial areas and then commercial areas. And so as a result, the cities are going to get themselves subdivided into different sections, again, kind of like what we have nowadays. What we'll notice in the slums, though, is there's a need in 1879 for housing for all these immigrants that are moving into our country. What you see right here is your dumbbell tenement. This was the creation of a newspaper campaign where they were trying to find people to create a brand new housing system for all the immigrants that were coming into the United States. The person who invented this created these dumbbell tenements. So this is looking down from the air. And each of these would have been a level in an apartment building. So this would have been one apartment right here, 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a parlor. What these actually turned into, though, was subdivided places. So slumlords would run these things, and this would be a home for a group of people. This would be a home for a group of people. And these would get radically overcrowded. People dump garbage down the air shafts. The air shafts are really good for spreading fire. And so these places are really nasty death traps. But they're going to be something that could house huge numbers of people in a very small space. We're going to find then that many of the people living in this area are going to find themselves drawn to America by industry. They are believing that they're entering a great place where they can move up, and instead they live in some place like this. And so the reality is not going to be nearly as good as what their dreams were when they started coming over. We're going to find that cities themselves can be very dangerous, and fire is one of those big problems. We're going to find that these buildings that are being built have no codes for them as far as what buildings need to have done, because largely they're coming out of a period where they weren't having to worry about a huge concentration of people living in a space. But Chicago shows us what happens in that situation where you just allow buildings to be managed and run the way that anybody wants to run them without any sort of regulation or observation. In Chicago, you had a bunch of buildings that were not prepared for a fire. They also had a fire department that was thoroughly not prepared for a gigantic inferno like the one that they had. And so all of downtown Chicago is going to get burned out in 1871, clearing out a bunch of buildings, calling to mind that there's probably some safety needs that should be considered when you're building buildings in a downtown area. But then also the clearing out of all the space has a side effect where now Chicago becomes one of the leading skyscraper cities because they've now got the space to start building. So this is the new environment that you're looking at. More and more people are moving into the cities. This is leading to urbanization, where we see cities becoming a much more important part of our society. And we're going to see changes in our society as a result of that. One of the things you should be noticing is that this is creating a pull factor. So when we talk about immigration, there are push and pull factors. We're going to see a pull factor where we have millions of people come to America who are immigrants from outside of our country. This immigration pattern that you should be noticing oftentimes will increase during times of prosperity. It will dip during times of economic catastrophe. And you'll also see that there are some push factors that they're describing here, like pogroms that are taking place over in Europe for Jewish people who find themselves being persecuted back in their home country. What we do want to notice, though, is this. In the old days, up until the 1880s, immigration was typically from England and Western Europe, and so these people would be known as our old immigrants. The change that we're going to see happening during this time is we're going to see waves of new immigrants coming in. We're going to see 300,000 Chinese immigrants who are going to move into the United States, many of them to help out either with the gold rush or else with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Many Irish people are going to come in during the same time period, and both groups are going to find themselves facing huge amounts of nativism that's going to make their immigration and assimilation really hard. In fact, you're going to have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 that officially will tell Chinese people at that point they are now no longer allowed to immigrate into the United States. One of the problems that's happening with this nativism is there's a fear that the Chinese, the Irish, and others will not assimilate into American life the way that they should, and the way that many people imagine they had done in the past, ignoring the fact that when people immigrated in the past, oftentimes they would live on a farm in isolation for generations, and they would largely not feel a lot of pressure to assimilate much beyond just learning the language and getting along with their neighbors. We're going to see, though, that there's a rise of new immigration, and this new immigration is going to come from places like Italy, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Poland. You're going to have a wave of Jewish people who are coming over during this time period, and you can see their numbers become quite large as they start migrating into the country. And for nativists, they're worried about immigrants who are coming in because there's a fear that these individuals coming over have different religions, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different viewpoints. They don't speak English as their primary language. Many of them are uneducated. And so there's a fear that when they come, many people wonder what are they going to do to America since they've already got a culture in America that's been established. Are they going to assimilate or are they going to resist? So for these new immigrants who are coming over, they're going to be facing all sorts of nativism because previously they were not the huge number of people who are coming in, but by the first decade of the 20th century, these are the majority of people who are coming into America. The individuals you see on this list are oftentimes going to live together with one another in places like New York and Chicago, in little Italies, little Polands. If you've heard about Chinatowns, that's going to be where a lot of Chinese people will congregate as well. And so you're going to find with these new immigrants, they're going to be living in America. They're going to be segregated largely out of choice and largely because they are hated by people who are considering themselves to be native of America, who have been here for multiple generations. For these immigrants, they're going to be leaving for both push and pull factors. And so for the push factors, we do have famines going on over in Europe. We do have wars that involve drafting. We do have all sorts of persecution taking place. But a lot of times the people who are going to be immigrating over to America are people who have at least some money to be able to engage in immigration. They have some motivation to leave the old country. And so for the millions of people who are going to be coming to America from Europe, a lot of them are not the lowest of the low in Europe, but many of them are coming over without very many skills that they can then apply into America. But what I want you to notice is while there are some people who are feeling nativistic, notice the list of people who want the immigrants to be coming over to America. For many of the people who want this to happen, they're wanting to bring over immigrants precisely for the same reasons that there are nativists that don't want them to come in. Factory owners would love to get more immigrants coming in so they can pay their workers less, which is a large reason why a lot of workers are nativistic, trying to keep immigrants out so they're not competing for the same jobs. We're going to find that when many of these immigrants come to America, then they're going to be coming from circumstances where leaving their home country has been traumatic, like when we take a look at the pogroms that are going on over against Jewish people in Poland. Many of these immigrants are coming from traumatic incidents, and many of them are not. So it's very much a case-by-case basis. Keep in mind also there are many people who are going to be coming here who are known as birds of paradise, who are coming over to work just temporarily, gather some cash, and then bring it back home. And so there are some people who don't plan on staying forever. You're going to find, though, that there's all of these attempts that you see down here that many immigrants are going to have to try to hold on to their old ways of doing things because they're facing a lot of backlash when they come to America to give up what makes them them and to assimilate. One of their other problems, though, is even if they assimilate, if you're still Catholic, you're still going to run into problems with the Protestants who are here. Jewish people feel the same sort of thing. And so regardless of if you pick up English quickly or get a job quickly, there are all sorts of discriminations that are going to be happening against these individuals, strictly because they are different than the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people who are dominant inside of our society at that time. So when we look at assimilation, notice first of all that while there are nativistic people who want assimilation to take place, the United States government is going to do virtually nothing when it comes to immigration. They're going to be running places like Ellis Island in New York, Angel Island in California, to process people to make sure that there's not like obvious criminals or people who are severely diseased coming into the country. But otherwise, there's virtually no limits on getting into our country during this time. For many of the state governments, they're doing very little to make sure that people assimilate because many of these immigrants are going to work as farmers or work inside of factories. And so instead, we're going to find that the people giving the most attention to the immigrants are political machines like the machine we described in class, Boss Tweed, who is planning on using these immigrants to help get bosses of political machine politicians elected to city government so that then Boss Tweed can engage in graft. What we then see is that there is a problem that's happening. We have immigrants who are coming to our country working really terrible jobs, getting paid very little, and there's not really a whole lot of assistance available for them. For a lot of the people who might want to help them, they're instead watching as the bosses are using a lot of these immigrants, and while they're giving them some things to help out the immigrants, very little is being done to actually use to provide a lot of support to help the immigrants out of their situation. For many individuals, then, they watch what's happening with immigration and the cities, and they see that the cities are a mess, that there are waves of immigrants who are coming in who are unsupported, and there's going to be very much people who start getting into the idea of reinvigorating religion once again. So even though it's not called this, many people see this as being like a third Great Awakening religiously inside of our country, where you have some religious people preaching the social gospel. And their big question is, what would Jesus do in this situation? If he came and he saw immigrants who are struggling and being abused in the factories, and poor people struggling in messy situations with like pollution and whatever, their assertion is that Jesus would step in and do something to help them out. So we've got a number of reformers then that we don't want to be noticing, where on the ground level they're pushing for reforms. First of all, Jane Addams. She is a wealthy woman who is going to buy a house in the center of an immigrant neighborhood in Chicago that was a mansion once upon a time, but then as the immigrants moved into that neighborhood, it was vacated, and so there's this large house sitting empty in the middle of this immigrant neighborhood. Jane Addams is going to buy it with family money, and she's going to create what's known as a settlement house. A settlement house is going to be kind of like a community center for immigrants, where she's doing a number of different things, providing English instruction, trying to help immigrants figure out how to navigate life in the big city, trying to provide child care for women who are working, trying to provide cultural activities and assimilation efforts for the immigrants who are there. And so it's very much a groundswell effort to try to help out with immigrants without having the government be the ones who are doing that, but instead she's trying to provide a safety net. You're going to find that other women are going to be inspired by Jane Addams, and many of them will found their own settlement houses in other major cities as well. We're going to also find that many of the women who will get involved at this time are very much going to be like the women prior to the Civil War, who, because they start getting involved in reform efforts, they're going to get more and more politically active. Like many of the women will start pushing for the idea of getting rid of sweatshops through government regulation to protect women workers, get rid of child labor, because they feel like this is something that should not be happening in a Christian culture like ours. You're going to find, though, that with the help for immigrants, you're going to see that immigrants largely are not going to be getting assistance from the majority of Americans, largely because many of the people in America are going to see the immigrants as being different, and culturally they are going to be seeing them as a challenge to what the status quo is. Also, what's troubling is the new immigrants are having a lot of children, and there's a fear that they're going to overwhelm the Americans with their birth rates, and then overwhelm American culture with their immigrant ideas instead. For many people who are working, they're very mad that these new immigrants are willing to work for lower wages than what they're asking for themselves, and so they keep driving down the wages that the workers are getting. And so many of the workers are angry, not at the business owners for paying them less, but for the immigrants who are coming over in waves, ignoring the fact that many of the businesses are over in Europe, advertising the opportunities that are available here in America. And so there's a big picture sort of thing that leads us to ask which group that should workers actually be bothered by. Many of these individuals in America are also going to blame the immigrants for corruption in city governments, that they're going to claim that they're the reason why the political machines have been able to gain the power that they've had. And so for virtually everybody in the United States, there's an opportunity for them to be nativistic if they want to, and anti-immigrant. Some people are going to be noticing, though, that there's a hypocrisy going on here, like this cartoon where you can see an immigrant coming off of the boat in the late 1800s being confronted by a lot of these men who are the elites in society who are harboring very nativistic feelings. But then if you look at the cartoon, the images behind them are the ghosts of their ancestors who were once very recently also new immigrants themselves, and they're choosing to ignore the fact that they're living in a society of immigrants, but they are now becoming very anti-immigrant because they want to protect the situation that they have currently. For nativists, though, what they're really pointing out is that these new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, they're bringing over ideas that challenge American capitalism, ideas like socialism, communism, and anarchism. Socialism is the idea that the government should own some businesses and create regulations to limit the way the businesses are run to try to provide safety nets for people inside society. Communism is the idea that all the businesses should be government run, that there should be no rich or poor, but instead all should be equal in wealth. And then anarchism is an anti-government movement where these individuals who have been in Europe and seen monarchies become dictatorial, and then they come to America and see that American government during this time period is very much in lockstep with businesses. They're going to argue that we would be better off with no government rather than the governments we have currently. We're going to find then that we have associations like the American Protective Association, which is going to try to figure out ways to limit the power that groups like the Roman Catholics have. You're going to find immigrants are going to be hated by unions because of the fact that they are going to be very hard to include in the union because of their language barrier. Plus, they're also willing to accept wages that are lower than what's going on with the union workers themselves. You'll find then Congress is going to be getting into the business of trying to limit the impact that immigrants are going to have. Like you can see, there's going to be a crackdown on people who are considered to be poor, and so they're going to criminalize the law when it comes to the ideas of if you're poor or you're a criminal or you're a convict, you're not coming to America, and they're going to try to stop them from coming to America. They're also going to try in 1885 to try to tell people who are coming into America who are already under contract from businesses, so their businesses going to Europe, hiring workers for contracts, usually to get paid less than what their factory workers are already getting paid. American government is going to say that that's illegal to bring in those sorts of workers as well. There's also going to be laws on the books to say that these individuals can also not come into the United States. Whether this is good or bad is definitely an eye of the beholder. The thing you should keep in mind, though, is many of these laws are going to be used in a very, very loose sort of way, where it's going to give the government the opportunity to ban people who are coming into the country because of the fact that there's fear of what they're going to do when they get into the country itself. And so we're going to find that this is setting up new barriers for immigration for fear of the people who are coming in. But let me remind you of the list that we had from previously. You had this list back here. While the government is doing these sorts of laws, remember this is laissez-faire economics, a lot of those immigration laws are going to be ignored in cases where businesses want them to be ignored. And so you're going to see that while they're putting out this noise about how they're limiting immigration, you've already seen from the graphs and charts, immigration is going to go through the roof during this time period. For our immigration also, one of the things you should realize is the Statue of Liberty is created during this time period of massive immigration, but also this massive wave of nativism. And so you've got kind of a two-way street going on where we aren't exactly on the same page as far as how Americans feel about immigration. For you, though, what you should be noticing with your textbook is, again, you do see another rise of religious fervor. So this is like another great awakening. For the Protestant churches, they're going to struggle because as people start moving into the cities, many of those old-style churches are going to start struggling because that community they had out in the rural areas is starting to go away. It's starting to fade. The power that the churches had is starting to get limited as well. And for many people politically, they start realizing that one of the burning issues they're worried about is the morality loss that we seem to be having during the Gilded Age. It seems like the poor people are working harder for less money. It seems like they're competing against immigrants who are coming to the country with new values, new ideas, and new religions. And so we're going to see that for many of these churches, they're going to feel the need to reinvigorate themselves. And into that comes the idea of our liberal Protestants, who are going to be coming up with a different take on Christianity than our fundamentalists have had previously. Fundamentalists are people who believe that the Bible should be interpreted literally, like word for word, everything inside the Bible is divinely inspired. The liberal Protestants, though, are going to come from the idea that they don't want to stress the literal word for word God. They want to focus on the ethical teachings of the Bible, and specifically they want to focus on reform to try to inspire change inside of our country to make religion grow. And many of these people are not just interested in taking care of their own religion, they also want to thrust their religion onto other people. So you're going to see religion become very aggressive as a reform tool for people who are coming to our country or for people who are already in our country. You'll notice inside your textbook it talks about by 1900 the Catholic Church is our largest single denomination inside the United States. Be careful with that. What they're talking about is Catholic compared to Baptist or Methodist or whatever. By and large, the majority of Christians inside the country by 1900 are still Protestants, but we see the Catholic Church has been growing by leaps and bounds because of the immigration that we see happening in the late 1800s. We're also going to see that by 1890, you have 150 denominations of the Christian faith, and so as a result, you're going to see that there's a lot of different takes on what Christianity is, and that's why when we get into questions soon about talking about religion inside of government, one of the big questions we run into is what should that look like, because these different denominations have different takes on not just how you worship Christianity, but also just how to interpret the faith itself. We did talk in class, though, about one of the religious groups called the Salvation Army, who is going to be gathering charitable donations, especially after the Panic of 1873, because they realized that when poor people encounter an economic crash, there's nothing inside the government to help them. So there are some people engaged in the social gospel to try to make sure that they're helping out the poor. You're also going to see the birth of a new church, the Church of Christian Science, which is going to be focused on the idea of Christianity and the impact that it can have on ill health and possible salvation through Christian Science, which is going to be a very controversial sort of take as we move forward, where for many people they will embrace this. Others will see this as being much more fundamentalist than being in step with what's happening scientifically with medicine at the same time period. So let's talk instead about what's going to be causing issues in the late 1800s. We're going to see that Charles Darwin is going to be incredibly important when we take a look at his theories in the mid-1800s, when he writes, after studying organisms throughout the world, that he notices this progression of evolution happening inside the natural world. This is going to create challenges for religion and also for science. When he does this, he is going to be sending out his information throughout the world, and we're going to find that many Christian people are going to have issues accepting the idea of evolution, because it does serve as a direct challenge to what you read in the book of Genesis, talking about the creation of the universe that's described biblically. What we're going to find, though, is that after 1875, there's going to be a number of people who, after scientists study this and come to the idea that they believe that that's the scientific truth, that evolution is taking place, you're going to see that there's going to be a split between liberal and conservative religious groups on this issue. For conservative religious groups involved in Christianity, many of them are going to become radically anti-Darwinian, anti-evolution. We're going to see that many, though, are going to, with their Christian faith, find themselves reconciling Christianity with the idea of evolution. And then we're going to see that's where a lot of the mainstream Christian religions are going to be going. But when we talk about our Great Awakenings, remember, most of our Great Awakenings have a split. First Great Awakening had old lights and new lights. Second Great Awakening had north and south. This is going to be the huge issue that helps to disrupt and tear apart the different types of Christian churches inside of our country over whether or not you accept the ideas of Charles Darwin and whether or not evolution meshes with your version of what creation looks like in the universe. As we move forward then, notice in the late 1800s, public education keeps growing with high schools, middle schools, high schools, elementary schools, kindergartens, and so we see those rapidly gaining. We're going to see that gaining more in the north than in the south, though. And so in the south, you still have a massive resistance against public schools, especially during this period now when they're discussing should schools be segregated or integrated. And so you're going to see a lot of places in the south that are very much not investing in education, and this is going to have a huge impact on the literacy rate, where you're going to see in the north there's a massive literacy rate increase compared to the south, which is not going to see that taking place. So you'll notice in the South, 44% of non-white Southerners can't read by 1900. 35 years after the Civil War, you can see how the Southern education system is failing, where they're not working actively to try to educate African Americans adequately to be even literate inside society. We have two different people that we want to then notice as we are taking a look at the issue of civil rights. So taking over for Frederick Douglass, we have two names that we want to be able to notice. The first is Booker T. Washington, and he is an African-American former slave who is living in Alabama. Booker T. Washington is going to be head of the Tuskegee Institute, and he's going to deliver a speech to a group of white Southern business owners in the late 1800s. And what he is going to be asking for is his plan, where he wants to come up with the idea for how can white business owners help out African Americans to improve their situation. And what he asked them to do is he asked the white business owners to hire African Americans to work in their factories instead of hiring immigrants who are not loyal to the United States. He is famous inside the speech because when he delivered the speech, he announced that we could be like he used the metaphor of a hand, where he said, imagine the center of your hand, your palm, can be like the place where both white and black people work together. That's where we can be integrated. He also said, though, that we can't push civil rights too quickly because he's a Southern man. He's been through slavery. He's lived with segregationists. And he says to these white business owners, I understand that if we push too fast, it'll cause race wars, tensions, lynchings, that sort of stuff. And so he said, while we can work together in a factory, kind of like the palm of our hand, imagine if your hand was spread out with your 5-finger spread. He said, when we go home at night, we could be like the 5 fingers of the hand, where you could be like one finger, the white group, and we could be like another finger, the black group, and we don't have to interact socially. We're just asking to interact economically. Now, what Booker T. Washington is talking about in his Atlanta exposition speech is he is then talking about how he wants to build a university where he can train African Americans to work inside the factories, and then he's hoping that gradually African Americans and white people, by being around each other so much, they can then learn to respect each other, get along with each other, and then eventually we can get rid of racism and discrimination, but it'll happen in multiple generations. We're going to find, though, that with this idea, Booker T. Washington is going to be very inspirational in the Deep South. He's going to be very influential, and white audiences love bringing him in because for many African Americans, Booker T. Washington is going to be seen as an accommodationist, where he's going to be seen as a little bit too soft on civil rights because he's saying what white people in the South want to hear. And one of the biggest questions that people are asking about his ideas is he's asking, number one, why would you need to train young African Americans to work inside of a factory? That just doesn't make any sort of sense. Training them to be farmers or work in other sorts of trades is nice, but it's not something that is necessary for the vast majority of African Americans who are going to be sharecropping or working inside of a factory. And even more so, even if you train these African Americans, they're walking into a very racist South, where even though Booker T. Washington is saying he's willing to wait for equality, many of these African Americans are walking out of Tuskegee Institute into a world where there's lynchings and terrorism taking place. For Booker T. Washington, though, he is going to be arguing from the perspective of a former slave living in the South, and so he is going to be recognizing that it's a very, very hazardous place to start advocating for much more aggressive movements than that. That's not what W.E.B. Du Bois is about, though. W.E.B. Du Bois is a different person. He is an African-American man who went through Harvard and got his Ph.D. He then traveled overseas and studied abroad for a period of time. And so he's been in the North, he's been in freedom, and he doesn't want to listen to Booker T. Washington's gradualism and separation. Instead, what W.E.B. Du Bois is going to be pushing for is two different things. He wants to create a group called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he also advocates for the creation of a talented 10th, where he wants to find the top 10% most capable African Americans that are in the United States and train them like crazy to make them into leaders so that they can then help elevate other people inside their race to better places. What Du Bois, his ideas are going to be doing is much more aggressive than what Washington wants to do. But even he is going to be running into issues where, even though he's more aggressive, he's still encountering racism that is equally as bad in the North as it was in the South. And so it's not like he's going to be finding a lot of traction for his ideas in the late 1800s, early 1900s either. We are going to find, though, that after the Civil War is done, many Americans are going to feel like in order to be successful in this new urbanized society, you can't just go off and farm. And so many people start going to high school, they start going to college, they start pursuing trades and crafts inside college beyond just theology, and we're going to see that colleges and universities are going to be growing quite a bit as a result of that. We're also going to see that our colleges and universities are growing because of what Abraham Lincoln did during the Civil War. He created the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. And what these schools are going to be is these are universities that are on land that's set aside out west. As we are creating new territories, we have these places that are called land grant colleges. They're going to be later known as our state universities, where this is going to be places that are going to be hotbeds, hothouses for coming up with new ideas and new technologies. One of the things that confuses a lot of kids when they take the class is they read about like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan and all the inventions that they're coming up with, which are absolutely true. But what many people ignore is that there's instances like this where the government is going to step in and build an institution like a university system, not for themselves, but instead what these universities are going to be doing is they're going to be studying, researching, inventing, and then those research developments are then released to the people so that they can use them. The land grant colleges here are being used to try to create laboratories for scientific farming that they can then use to give out to people so that they can then take those advances. If you've ever heard of like A&Ms, like Texas A&M, an agricultural and machining university comes from these Morrill land grant colleges. And if you look at the state of Minnesota, our University of Minnesota is famous especially for the apples they keep creating, like our Honey Crisps and those sorts. Were invented by our universities that can then be shared with the farmers so that they could then use that to become better farmers inside the United States. We're going to find that on top of the Morrill Land Grant Act, we're going to remember the gospel of wealth that we learned about in the previous chapter. Carnegie's idea that rich people shouldn't die wealthy. They should instead donate money so that they're able to help improve and create ladders for poor people to move up into prosperity. And so we're going to see the universities like Stanford University, Vanderbilt University, and so on being built by monopoly owners so that they're able to help elevate people out of the situation that they're in. As a result of this growth in education, we're going to see then a boom of education inside of our country. Immigrants are going to come to our country to seek an education at these universities, and then the products of these universities will share their talents back here in America, and that highly educated group is going to help create even more inventions moving in the future. And so that we see a huge influence coming on with our university system created during this time period to try to figure out ways to help boom in our society. We'll see that our university structure is going to change. They're going to change what our education looks like so that they're able to create a much more modern educational process. And we're going to see the rise of new fields inside the universities to deal especially with modern technological challenges, business challenges, and so on. We're also going to see a rise in medical schools, and medical science is going to make huge gains during this time period. Now you get into this part of your chapter where we can probably gloss over an awful lot of stuff. And so let me highlight what's going on here. Number one, notice in the late 1800s, the key is still there. America is a highly literate society. Even though we highlighted the fact that there are many people who are still illiterate, the people who are illiterate usually can find somebody who can read to them or give them the gist of stories or whatever. And a lot of Americans love reading books and magazines during this time period. It's part of the reason why Andrew Carnegie made that such a facet of his gospel of wealth, where he built 1,700 public libraries around the United States. His deal, though, is he would build the building. You had to provide the books. And so if your community wouldn't do that, then you were out of luck. But we're going to find that this becomes a huge element of our society. Both books, newspapers are going to be booming during this time period. And we're going to see that the newspapers are going to take on an era of almost like tabloid journalism. Notice the name Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. They're going to be engaging in what's known as yellow journalism. This is like tabloid journalism, and this term especially is going to be used in upcoming chapters when they're going to be using their newspapers and foreign events to try to sell newspapers while also bringing us dangerously close to the brink of war. And so they're going to spread in their newspapers sometimes facts, sometimes absolute lies and fake news, in order to try to sell as many newspapers as possibly can. And we're going to find that this brings up ethical questions that we'll be focusing on soon when we return after break is done. We're also going to find that many of these publishers are going to be helping to hire muckrakers who are going to be producing books that are meant to expose problems that are happening inside of our society. When we look at these magazines, many of these magazines then, like I mentioned with the muckrakers, are engaged in reform efforts. And when we look at those reform efforts, we're going to highlight a few names. Number one, notice Henry George. This is the name you'll want to notice in the late 1800s. He is a guy who starts noticing that we crash the economy about every 10 years, and it's the poor people who get hurt by that. He also noticed that tariffs seem to hurt poor people worse than it does rich people. And so what he argues is that what we should have is a gigantic property tax to be our only way of funding our government. Let's get rid of tariffs and other sorts of taxes, and let's just put a tax on property. You own property, then you're going to be the ones paying the taxes, and especially the biggest property owners in the country are the railroad owners. So while big business owners were horrified, many poor people, especially in the late 1800s, thought that sounded like a great idea rather than paying tariffs, which hurt them, while rich people seem to be doing pretty well on their own. You also have books like written by guys like Edward Bellamy, and the only thing to notice with him is he's going to be writing a book called Looking Backwards, where he imagines a guy fell asleep in 1887, wakes up in 2000, and America has become a socialist country. And the book itself is going to be looking at what's happened in America with a positive outlook at what happened when government took over big businesses, and instead of punishing poor people, they were working to help out poor people. And so for many poor Americans, this was inspirational and interesting. For many people who preferred the status quo and especially owned those businesses, they were very much not in favor of that. Finally, notice Victoria Woodhull. She is a woman in the late 1800s, and she is going to be somebody who starts writing about her belief in free love and open sexuality. And this is going to create a backlash. And so when we take a look at what's going on in your late 1800s, you should have a group of Americans uniting together economically, because they are having issues where a few people are getting rich during the Gilded Age, a vast number of people are becoming poor. Instead, what they're going to find themselves distracted by is morality battles, where they're going to get into battles over what is and is not immoral. And we're going to find that a man that you see on this page, Anthony Comstock, is famous for creating his Comstock Law, which made all sorts of impure things illegal, like pornography and other sorts of things that can be transmitted through the mail. And he's going to be working actively to try to figure out ways to root out all sorts of immoral things that are corrupting our society. And oftentimes he's highlighting the idea that it's immigrants who are bringing this immorality with them over to America. This will help to unite Democrats and Republicans. And so huge numbers of people will come together with the idea that they need to stop the flow of immigrants, especially the Chinese, and stop their influences on our societies. And that's going to be a huge uniter, although it's going to distract from the issues that are still emerging in our societies economically, and that's going to keep a lot of people divided during the late 1800s. We're going to find also that in this new urban environment, we're going to see that a lot of poor families are struggling. They're going to be isolated. They're going to be living on their own. You've got a lot of people working inside the factories, mom, dad, and even kids. A lot of people in America are using birth control during this time period, even though it's rudimentary and it's taboo. So a lot of people aren't open about that, but we can see with the birth rates that there are a lot of people who are choosing not to have kids, while immigrants are very much not making those choices. A lot of times because their Catholic faith says that that's not something that they should be doing. That disparity that you have, where people from America initially are seeing their birth rates drop while immigrants are having huge numbers of kids, is going to cause a lot of fear and tension that perhaps they're going to watch as America gets overwhelmed. We're also going to see a rise of divorces that starts happening in the late 1800s, which is going to be troubling to many Americans, and we're going to see that number rise as we move into the future, leading us to where we are today. For many women, though, what they're going to be finding is in the late 1800s, there's a reinvigoration of the women's rights movement. Many women start joining the workforce. Many women are also pushing for suffrage during this time period. But notice that women, white women and African American women, are not reuniting during this time period. For many white women, they're still bitter about the fact that they did not get the right to vote with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And many of the white women are also nervous about the rising racism inside of our country, and they're fearful if they unite with African Americans, this will destroy their movement. So you have a number of new groups that are popping up. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were both inspirational in the Seneca Falls Convention and are still working hard during this time period. We're also going to find that there are new reformers like Carrie Chapman Catt who are going to be coming onto the scene as well, pushing that they are trying to get the right to vote, but they're changing their battle tactics. What women are doing during this time period is they're arguing that instead of women getting the vote because of the fact they should be equal to men, many women are starting to argue that because of their roles as being the moral centers of society, that's the reason why they should get the right to vote, to clean up the messes that are happening inside of society itself. We're going to see that many Western states are going to embrace this. Places like Wyoming out west and other Western states are going to start moving in that direction. So by the time we actually get to 1920 with the creation of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, many states had already permitted that, even though it wasn't nationwide permitted. Now, when it comes to women's rights, we were talking about first women pushing for suffrage, and that'll eventually be accomplished in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Well, we also want to notice this name down here. And so we've got three civil rights leaders in the late 1800s who are going to be taking over for the abolitionists of like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. Booker T. Washington, who wanted slow, gradual equality by helping African Americans get jobs inside of factories, so they could prove gradually that they deserved equality with white Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's pushing for immediate equality with white people and trying to accumulate a talented tenth of people who would then be able to demonstrate leadership and help to elevate the race. And then finally is Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells helps to highlight for you how terrible the situation was for African Americans in the late 1800s, where what she's pushing for is just trying to figure out ways to roll back lynchings that are taking place, which are happening in massive numbers. In some years in the late 1800s, they're having nearly one lynching every couple of days of both white and African American people. And so that's her main cause. She'll eventually become part of the NAACP too with W.E.B. Du Bois, but that's what her major thing is in the late 1800s, is can we just dial back on the illegal lynchings that are terrorizing African Americans. Like I mentioned to you, though, one of the reasons why you don't see an awful lot of economic reform happening in the late 1800s is because a lot of the reform is dividing rather than unifying groups of people, especially nativists and immigrants. And one of the biggest groups that's going to be doing this is the battle against alcohol. We're going to have prohibition parties, anti-alcohol movements, and we're going to see the rise of dry counties and dry states, largely led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women's Christian Temperance Union is going to be very much focused on the idea of trying to roll back the amount of alcohol that's being consumed. So when they talk about temperance, that doesn't necessarily mean prohibition. All that means is trying to slow down the amount of alcohol that's being consumed. You have Frances Willard, who is a very powerful force in this, and she is leading a morality campaign not just against alcohol, but also against abortion, birth control, and other sorts of evils that she sees in society. And she's joined by Carrie Nation, and Carrie Nation is a very interesting woman whose husband was abusive. He died of alcoholism, and she would travel throughout the western frontier with her hatchet, and she would go into these wild saloons on the western part of the United States in the Midwest. And she would walk in and start smashing alcohol bottles. She would then get locked up, and then she would be released because a lot of her supporters in the WCTU would then send her bail money and new hatchets to replace the one that got confiscated. So when she showed up at the door, and she would walk in and she'd say, "Hello, sinners," and she'd start swinging her hatchet at alcohol. She was a very powerful demonstration of how she could then start fighting back against alcohol. We're going to see the Anti-Saloon League created in 1893, and many states are going to start going towards not just temperance, but prohibition. We're also going to see people start focusing on things like the prevention of cruelty to animals. If you've heard about the ASPCA that's created in the late 1800s by groups who are trying to figure out how to reform that aspect of society. The Red Cross will be coming after the Civil War to try to figure out ways to provide aid to people both during wartime and during civilian times. When we take a look at this late 1800s, though, we also have a period where people just like reading books. The late 1800s, people love dime novels. These are just cheap Western books or other sorts of adventure stories. And so knowing about these is important just culturally, but not necessarily for your next test. A name that you do want to know about is Horatio Alger, though, because Horatio Alger is a guy who wrote stories about rags to riches American dream sentimentality. And so his stories would always take somebody who was down on their luck, but because of their hard work ethic and dedication, they would then be able to achieve the American dream by being able to find success. And so essentially the message was, if you work hard enough, you can get the American dream. In the early Horatio Alger books, though, they all included the idea that each of these people also got lucky. So it wasn't guaranteed that hard work would get them to where they wanted to be. They also need to have an ounce of luck. But once he started getting feedback from the readers that they didn't want that, he started taking that out. And these stories then eventually just became this mythology of, if you work hard enough in America, there's no reason for you to be poor. And that becomes a very powerful mentality that's going to sweep throughout our country. We're going to find then in the late 1800s, we're going to have different writing schools that are taking place. And for these, there's just going to be very selective things that you need to dial into, and otherwise you should be safe. Like, you do not need to know the name William Dean Howells. He is a very aggressive reformer in the late 1800s. When he is focused on the idea of what's going on inside of our country and the issues of what's happening with morality. The name you do need to know about, though, is Mark Twain. Mark Twain is going to be famous for his satire, especially writing during the Gilded Age. He is very good at taking issues that are controversial and making them accessible. Books like Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer are going to be his most notable, highlighting the issues of sectionalism prior to the Civil War. But Mark Twain's the guy who gives the nickname to the Gilded Age of the Gilded Age. For Henry James, you do not need to spend much time memorizing him for our U.S. history class. I would not devote a lot of time to him. And when it comes to Edith Wharton, she is much more important when combined with a more rigorous American literature focus. But your 10th grade curriculum, it does not have that sort of classical American focus. And so for Edith Wharton, she's a famous author of the time, but it's not going to be important for your test that we're going to be having in class. When we look at naturalism, notice what naturalism is about. It's trying to figure out ways to study human beings, taking a look at what's happening in society, and very much getting in to the idea of what is causing a human being to be the way that they are. So many of these authors are taking a look at life not as how they think it should be, but they're instead taking a look at the gritty elements of how it actually is. I'd like to highlight for you the name Frank Norris, because he's going to be one of our muckrakers. And his metaphor of the octopus is going to become a synonymous one with monopolies, with the idea that you've got these businesses that are sending out tentacles to take over railroads or politicians or other sorts of groups. But otherwise, you aren't going to need to know about these individuals very deeply either. When it mentions to you regionalism is going to be very much focusing on trying to flesh out the differences that are happening in areas of society, and writing specifically about those areas of the country to illuminate them to other people in other parts of the world. But as I scan forward, these names, if you're looking for stuff to read, they're all fine. But as far as our next test, they're not going to be needed. When it comes to artists, the artists that you see during this time period with realism and regionalism is going to be an element that starts working its way through the artwork of the time, where again, these people are moving away from portraiture, away from landscapes, and you've got now artistry that again is gaining not just a national but an international following. For these artists, though, again, you do not need to spend a lot of time focusing on them either. They will not be a major part of your U.S. history test. When it comes to music, we're going to find that musically there are trends that I want to be noticing. Number one, the idea that in many major cities you have many orchestras and theaters that are being created, oftentimes created by those captains of industry, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, like Carnegie Hall in New York, so that you can go someplace and see what culture and civilization looks like. But we also want to notice that coming out of the South, we're seeing musical techniques like ragtime that is coming into vogue, and eventually all of these elements will lead us to our jazz transition that we're going to learn about in the early 1900s. So that's swelling during this time period. We're also going to find that people can get music inside their homes because of the phonograph and also player pianos that they have, that is going to eventually get rid of the old sitting room piano where you take out a piece of sheet music and instead you have something mechanically that can play you music for you. You also have a movement inside the late 1800s of people who are feeling like they need to combat the grittiness and ugliness that's taking place inside the cities. And we see a movement called the City Beautiful movement. So if you do see like a century-old park or other sorts of green space inside cities, a lot of those places were created here with this movement in both the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul to try to give them less of an urban sort of feel and more of a feel like it's something that's got nature connected to it. This man especially was important, so if you ever go down to Theodore Wirth Park, you can see his influence on that green space that runs right next to our inner city areas. The most important of these trends is the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. So in 1893, they create this right here, and this gigantic white city is created on the shores of Lake Michigan in Chicago, where they build all these fake canals that are not permanent. They're just built there for the exposition. They build up all these buildings for the exposition, and they put every brand new invention that's available there at this time as a way to show off in 1893 how great America is and how much they have actually progressed. This show right here, though, is a great example of the Gilded Age. So while this show is going on, and you've got thousands of people who will go to Chicago during the summer of 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, they're coming to check out all this cool technology, and we're also suffering the Panic of 1893 simultaneously. So you have the highs and lows of the Gilded Age, and at this point, a lot of Americans are starting to ask the question, this is cool, but when the economy crashes, it seems to hurt a gigantic chunk of the population that has no nest egg built up for that. Should we have something different than that? And so that's going to lead us into the debates about reform that are coming soon. Final thing that you guys should be noticing is how entertainment changed in the late 1800s. You have theaters, you have the circus like P.T. Barnum. So if you've noticed that we've got that Showman movie that's coming out right now, there's the subject of that. You have Wild West shows like Buffalo Bill Cody, who is going to be traveling from town to town, showing people these fake Native American battles inside this gigantic high-top tent. And he'll in fact hire a bunch of Native Americans who are involved in those wars to participate in these reenactments, and that's going to be the way that some of them are employed afterwards to demonstrate what the battles look like according to Buffalo Bill's imagination. We have the first baseball leagues that are formed during this time period. Basketball's invented. We have football games. Are going to come into vogue, but these football games are very different because of the fact that they would lead to multiple fatalities every single year because they were very much more rough and tumble than the style of football that we have nowadays. You have boxing during this time period. It was bare knuckles boxing, and bare knuckles boxing was something that would go on until somebody was knocked out, and so this is pretty brutal sort of stuff to be watching. But a lot of Americans are going to fall in love with that, along with gaining a whole lot of activities that come with both kerosene light from John D. Rockefeller and then Edison's light bulb leads to playing, reading, shopping, and talking, all done in the evening after work is done in a house that's now lit. So that is chapter 25. I would keep in mind that when you're looking at the stuff that's happening in this PowerPoint, a solid half of this PowerPoint is there for color and flavor, but it's not necessarily going to be something that is going to be showing up on your test. Most notably, as you get to this section that's titled Post-War Fiction, Lowbrow and High, be looking for trends and movements. Be noticing that the names that I highlighted for you, but be also cognizant of the fact that a lot of this stuff is more just meant to be flavor. Hopefully your break is going well. I'm excited to see you guys next week. Hopefully everything is going good with you, and if you have any problems, feel free to email. But again, remember, we're going to be reviewing this stuff on Monday as we finish up our Steel Empire game, and then we'll also have a review session Monday night that should help you out. Again, have a good rest of the break, and I will see you on Monday.